I'm delighted to introduce Tim Harris, who's the CEO of Wesgro and has been for some number of years. They say behind every great man is a great woman, so what Tim has going for him mostly is that his wife is Irish. Actually, I was wondering how Tim did so well with now, but I did find out that he made I totally understand. But anyway, Tim, you're very welcome. Thanks very much. Thanks for coming to talk to us.
Thanks so much, Frank, and thank you for hosting us here at the beautiful hotel and to Business Island. Well, good to see you again. It's been really great working with you over the years of all the iterations of Business Island, and I'm glad that you're back with such force in such difficult times with a hybrid event like this. So I have the perfect setup there from the two ambassadors giving the lay of the land between the Irish-South African relationship, and then the two CEOs of the business chambers. And Mary in particular, I enjoyed that very effective euphemism where you described the Irish weather as variable. It's a bit like saying the Irish and the South African share is modest, just like the English rugby team. It's a very powerful euphemism. But as Frank said, my wife is Irish. That means I have an Irish mother-in-law. And when she took us back to see where she grew up, so she's an O'Donoghue from Ringsend in Dublin, and she had described growing up in this Catholic family in Ringsend, and it sounded a lot like Angela's Ashes, very, very difficult upbringing, but full of joy in terms of her memory. And she took us down this little street a few years ago, and she almost couldn't see her house behind this enormous headquarters that Airbnb had built for Europe in Dublin. And it really, the story that she had told us contrasted with this incredible investment of just one company that you've heard Mary talk about many others in Dublin. It was just a very powerful, I think, example of what Frank spoke about initially, about the promise of the Irish experience in recent years and what that means for a city like Cape Town and for all of us here in the Western Cape. And that's really Wesgro's mission. So Wesgro is acting from the government perspective. I see our DDG, Rashid Tofi, has joined us on the call. Thanks for joining us, Rashid. We're funded by the province and the city to help facilitate inward investment, in this case from Ireland, exports to Ireland, and tourism from Ireland. I just want to take you through a couple of slides, if I can, if we have them, to show you the story, firstly, of the impact of the COVID crisis on us over the past year, because that's very much our reality. Secondly, a short update on the structure of the Cape economy, and then how we're doing in terms of this trading, investment, and tourism relationship with Ireland. I'll kick off while you bring the slides up, because it's important to note that it's been a very difficult year for everyone, particularly us here in the Cape. But there are some points of light. I've got the controller. If you just make it full screen, I'll just take over. So the crisis in COVID had some points of light in, there we go. In terms of the impact on primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors in the Cape, you can see the primary sector actually sustained fairly well through the crisis. That's agriculture in the Western Cape, and that's notwithstanding the logistics issues we faced, a really strong performance from agriculture. You'll see in a little while how that was shored up, particularly by the Irish export performance, but also global exports on the Western Cape. Secondary sector really hammered up to 30% decline through the worst months of the lockdown. But the tertiary sector, this is services. This is some of the stuff on the right of this slide, which makes up about 75% of the Western Cape. Talking about wholesale, retail, transport, finance, government, and personal services. This is the real story of the Cape economy. It makes up the majority of our employment and of our output. And of course, that secondary sector, manufacturing, about 15% of our output in the Western Cape. What's interesting is people regard us as an agricultural economy, but only about 5% of our output is in agriculture. Nevertheless, those services sectors I described were incredibly resilient to COVID because you could do what we're doing in this room now, shift your operation virtually. Much harder to do that in in secondary sectors like manufacturing. So these are the sectors that are really growing in terms of headquarter decisions for global companies and African champions in South Africa. Mary had a very powerful story about corporates choosing Dublin. On our side, we've long had the biggest companies in retail, agribusiness, and asset management. But what's really exciting is the sectors of the future. We heard our ambassador talk about what's happening in tech. We would add sustainable, renewable energy to that. These are sectors where the largest companies in South Africa are choosing to headquarter from Cape Town in the Western Cape. And then right across the breadth of the Western Cape province, we have sectors like oil and gas. Our ambassador mentioned the Saldanha Bay Industrial Development Zone, agricultural sector, and obviously tourism, which we're predicting will make a strong comeback once we're through the current COVID crisis. So when you step back and you look at these headquarter companies, both multinational and local, choosing to operate on an African basis and sometimes globally from here in the Cape, you can see this is a story of real corporate success here in Cape Town in the Western Cape. And part of that's because of inward FDI. So Ireland, in our latest numbers, is showing up as the 8th largest investor by capex into the Western Cape. And if you look in terms of sectors, you can see that the big growth nodes around business services and software and IT, as well as some big numbers coming in renewable energy with renewables projects that launched in the Western Cape. Can you just go forward? So this is our export performance. This slide is quite an interesting shift because of COVID. For the last few years leading up to the lockdown, the rest of Africa was by far our largest export market, but last year it was overtaken by strong demand from Europe. So that's why African growth has dropped off to the bottom half of that graph, even as Europe has surged back as a buyer of Western Cape products. And these are our top 10. You can see Netherlands 1, UK 2, USA number 3. And some interesting new entrants, China really rising quickly up our top 10 buyers of Western Cape products. UAE entering with us and Lesotho too this year. So a real shift in trading patterns brought on by the effects of COVID. Stuck again. Sorry. Okay. So now digging into the Irish relationship, our ambassador spoke about the trade deficit with South Africa. It's a similar story in the Western Cape. Previous slide.
Got it.
One more. Back. One more. Back, sorry. All the way back. Forward.
So going forward.
Okay, I've got control again. There we go. So there's the, I don't know if you can move the Zoom folk joining us on the right there, but you'll see the picture is of a trade deficit from the Western Cape towards Ireland, but it's certainly one that is reducing. That blue line that growing into 2018 will continue to grow through 2019 and 2020, which represents about a 14.5% average growth in Western Cape exports to Ireland since 2016, while imports have grown from Ireland, but by a much lower number, below 2%. So what's happening is trade is balancing on a bilateral basis between the Western Cape and Ireland. And here's a picture of how it's balancing. So about 75% of our exports are fruits, citrus fruit, apples, pears, and grapes. I'm a bit alarmed, Frank, to see that wine is down 9% in terms of exports to Ireland, so you please need to encourage your friends to buy and drink more of Western Cape's wine. But this is a fairly common export basket for us into Ireland, some extraordinary performance in terms of agricultural exports right through 2020 and the worst times of the lockdown. In terms of imports, between meats and whiskey, you won't be surprised to see it's about 50% of Irish imports into the Western Cape. The rest, including some peat, I was interested to see. I presume you're using that to make whiskey. I stand corrected on that, but that's an interesting item falling in the top 10. The rest is an interesting mix of agricultural and capital equipment bringing into the Western Cape from Ireland. The export picture is mirrored by some really encouraging developments for investment. These are some of the Irish investments into the Western Cape over the past decade, about $3 billion US dollars worth of investment that we've got recorded. And then, of course, some interesting output investment from Cape companies like Triggerfish, Sinex, Oasis. We could also talk about Sanlam and Coronation investing out of the Western Cape into European headquarters in Dublin. Part of that story is what I need to ask for your help with, which is connectivity from Cape Town and the Western Cape to the rest of Africa and the world. This is our flight network. We're going into the COVID lockdown, and our team is working super hard to get these flights back. After the lockdown, particularly our network into the rest of Africa, which achieves what many of the speakers have spoken about as our ambition of positioning Cape Town as an entry point into wider African opportunity. We believe there's a strong prospect for Dublin Cape Town. We've been talking to Aer Lingus about it for many years. The ambassador has been incredibly helpful in terms of making this argument. We know there are about 37,000 passengers per year traveling between Cape Town and Ireland. You should know that we have a flight on Vienna Airlines with 24,000 passengers with a regular scheduled service. So that shows that with 37, Aer Lingus definitely can make it work, particularly because of the growth, about 11% growth in the travellers on that routing, and a strong growth in air cargo, which is becoming more and more important for carriers in these times. The Irish ambassador mentioned the 38,000 Irish passport holders, and we believe that our destination, what Frank spoke about, across investment, across tourism and export, is a destination for the future for Irish travellers. So what I want to ask you for is your help convincing Aer Lingus that this is a routing that makes sense. I'm sure everybody in this room will agree, but you'll be surprised how often a new flight is influenced by a volume of individual folk lobbying for what's actually happening between Dublin and a market like Cape Town, between Ireland and South Africa. Thank you very much.